Good afternoon, everyone. Numbers are starting to come in. Hi, everyone. Hope you are all keeping warm and keeping safe today. And thank you all for joining. I'll give just a couple moments for people to start filtering in. In the meantime, please, in the chat box, if everyone could just write to us, let us know who you are, where you're from. That would be great. But please, if you could address all your chat messages and questions to all panelists and attendees. Right at the bottom in the chat box, there is an option for panelists, and the second one, all panelists and attendees. Please go all panelists and attendees, just so that everyone can get involved in the conversation. Okay, we'll just give a few more seconds for people to jump on. Okay. Hi, Lorato, got you. Hello, Precious. Thanks for joining. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds and then we will kick off. Okay, I think let's get cracking. So today's HR in Durban Network is brought to you in partnership with Yellowseed Consulting. Yellowseed are made up of a diverse team of qualified psychologists, HR consultants, technology architects, and creative designers that work in partnership with their clients to find innovative ways to attract, develop, engage, and retain the right people in their business. So just the right crowd for today's topic. So in South Africa, the skills gap is vast, and the skills for the new generation of jobs are difficult to acquire. In a longitudinal test of creative potential, a NASA study found that of 1,600 4- and 5-year-olds, 98% scored at creative genius level. 5 years later, only 30% of the same group of children scored at the same level. And again, 5 years later, only 12%. When the same test was administered to adults, it was found that only 2% scored at this genius level. According to the study, our creativity is drained by our education. This is not the only thing that is hampered by our education. Many adults struggle to unleash accelerated learning because their brains were taught to think, learn, and repeat information in a certain way during school. Other studies have shown a massive increase in the skills gap in South Africa. Millions of jobs are becoming redundant, and while a bigger number of jobs are being created in its place, the skills required for these jobs are difficult to acquire for many South Africans. On top of all of this, organizations have been hit with a global pandemic, which required employees to very quickly learn new skills just to cope with the changing business landscape. Most businesses require employees to unlearn and relearn a tremendous amount of new skills to thrust their business into a competitive future. But this is easier said than done, but it can be done. In the next hour, we discover practical examples for how to accelerate learning for the new reality, how to create cultures of learning through addictive learning design, and how to identify learning needs proactively to cater for the predicted skills gap. Our fantastic panel today is made up of learning scientist and author, Professor Nick van Dam, Old Mutual Group Talent and Learning Executive, Sanjana Joshua, Yellowseed Consulting Head of Learning and Development, Ryno Zeelie, and Yellowseed Consulting Head of People Development, Professor Lomé Koekemoer. And thanks to the four of you for your time today. Before we sort of kick off and just really to start the whole scene setting thing, I want to just run two quick polls, which I'll just allow you guys a couple of seconds to answer. So the first poll, what are the biggest learning and development stumbling blocks you experience? There are 5 options. If we could all sort of, if you guys could just list whatever's most relevant to you. Okay, thank you. See the numbers coming in. See, Prof Nick is eagerly looking at at what the audience is saying. Okay, I'll give you 10 seconds more. Okay, I'm going to end that one. Okay, we'll quickly have a look at those results. So it seems, yeah, but sort of evenly spread, but really the top one seems to be lack of motivation to drive own learning, which is also interesting. And then quickly go into the second poll. Need to just find that one. Okay. Can't seem to find the second poll. We'll get to that in a second. But before we kick off with the panel discussion, I just want to ask Ryno to come off mute and really just give us a bit of an introduction to himself, to Yellow Seed, and then obviously to the topic today. Thanks, Ryno.
Great. Let me quickly share my screen here. Great, so thank you, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, it's very interesting to see the polls coming in. You know, as head of learning and development at Yellow Seed, it's always interesting to see, even with our clients, you know, the lack of motivation and self-driven learning is a big theme, and it's interesting to see it now coming out through the polls and the results as well. So I think the real question, you know, with this landscape that we're in now is, why do we need to accelerate learning? Why is this such a burning topic? And I think a good way to illustrate that, like Nick, you introduced in the beginning, is really the skill shortage, which is a reality of South Africa at the moment. Because if you look at the concern, you know, South Africa's GDP has declined by 43% in the last decade. And our unemployment with COVID has risen to 32.5%, which is alarming. And what we have been seeing with the studies found by McKinsey and various other studies have also found that digitization creates a great opportunity for growth of jobs and new opportunities. But what we are seeing is that South Africa and many other countries are lacking behind with the type of skills that are required by this job. So even though there's more jobs, I think the narrative in many people's heads are unemployment is because of, you know, there's not enough jobs. Jobs are declining. We're becoming redundant as human beings. But what the studies are actually seeing is that it's the contrary. It's creating more jobs. But the problem is really, how do we fill those gaps of the skills, you know? So in 2030, there's going to be a net growth of 1.2 above the average. So the new skill, the new landscape, the new world of work requires new things from us as individuals, as organizations, as governments as a whole, you know. So if you look at the Get Smarter studies that were done, they found the top valuing skills, you know, analytical, critical thinking, interpersonal skills, you know, technical skills, also leadership and digital capability in that order. And that is transforming into a new reality where analytical and critical thinking is still staying the same. It's still a crucial part. So being able to think on your feet and really problem solve is always going to stay important in this agile and fast moving world that we're living in. But what we're seeing is that leadership is going to be really rising up into the ranks, self-leadership, other, you know, management of teams, and really defining that for you as an individual is becoming more and more important according to the studies. And so the technical skills and the personal skills are all becoming critical. And I think that moves it a little bit away from our traditional learning environments where, you know, it was maybe a bit more fixed, and it's moving into a reality where our world is agile. It's continuously evolving. It's continuously changing. So I wanted to just position that those studies in today's conversation, because I think what we're seeing is now, as a collective, as organizations, as individuals, as government, we need to address the skill shortage. There's a real burning platform here, and our future depends on it. So how do we create that ecosystem, that culture, that environment where firstly those skills are obviously addressed, but from a individual point of view as well, that people are encouraged. It becomes a pull strategy, not a push down, push strategy. They want to learn. How do we develop those mindsets to really empower that ecosystem of learning and change ultimately? So I'm going to just pause there, and I think maybe a lot more will come out of the conversation, but just to position that South African context for our audience as well. Thanks, Nick.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you, Ryno. I did see I had a problem. That was a problem in chair on my side. So before we carry on, just the second poll, which we wanted just to get the input, your input. You'll see it on the screen now. The question is, which learning focus areas are the most challenging for your organization at the moment? You just, in the next sort of 5-10 seconds, please just let us know your thoughts on that, please. Also some interesting stuff coming through. It does seem to be a bit of a mixed bag. Doesn't seem to just be one problem. Cool, and I'll give you 2 more seconds. Or maybe a couple more, because there's a couple of options to read through. Okay, ending the poll. And as you can see, like I mentioned, a bit of a mixed bag, but one of the biggest either seems to be on the EQ training side of things or supervisory management training. Great, cool, thanks everyone. So let's get cracking with our panels. So my first thing I'd like to find out is, what can organizations do to accelerate learning for their employees? And I'd like to throw that out to Prof Nick and also hear the thoughts from Sanjana from an Old Mutual perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining the session today, and greetings from Amsterdam. So a couple of thoughts on this. I think if we look at learning, we often look at formal learning and the informal learning. And the formal learning is the learning that people get, kind of organized by L&D, and depending on organization and country, it's something like it's something between 20 and 40 hours a year, if you look at some numbers. And I would argue that even you take the high end, the 40 is even not sufficient to keep most people relevant in their existing jobs, right? Now, the question is, okay, so how to accelerate capability development? As mentioned, there's a huge need for more skills, more capabilities in organizations. And I would say it's not necessarily to say, well, can we turn the 40 into the 50 or in 60? And of course, it's nice, but that will not necessarily address the issue. So therefore, what I believe, and based on my research, I've been with McKinsey, as some of you know, and might have seen. There are a couple of things here. One is organizations need to embrace what I call a learning for all culture, recognizing that every person who's on the payroll needs to be developed, no matter who you are. Secondly, as we all spend, take a number, right? So 16, 17, 1800 hours on the job. What if we turn the workplace into a learning place? What if people learn something new every day by doing their job, and design work in a way that people indeed are learning and growing every day? And last but not least, and we will talk more about it later probably, how can we help people to develop mindsets for lifelong learners? Because if you look at people who are currently joining the workforce, let's say in their early 20s, it's likely that in many countries around the world, they need to stay employable until they are in the late 60s or maybe early 70s. So in other words, people have to work for 50 years. So how to stay employable for 50 years in a fast changing world? So lifelong learning mindsets are key to that.
Great, thank you. And then Sanjana, from an old, what have you seen particularly at Old Mutual and the sort of the lessons you've learned in that sense?
Sure, thanks, Nick. Thank you to Yellow Seed for inviting me to join the panel. Really exciting topic. So building on what Prof has just mentioned, I think from an organizational perspective, it really comes down to being embedded in the business strategy. If we don't get that right, I think the learning agenda will not take priority in any organization. So really owning the CHRO seat at the table to influence business leaders is critical. In our organization, we have found that our ExCo members and senior leaders endorse the learning agenda and in fact own it. And I think that's critical to ensure that when we're accelerating learning across an organization of our size, of 30,000 employees, one cannot do it through the L&D function or specialists or even the HC fraternity alone. One needs to influence across the ecosystem, and it starts with senior leadership endorsement. I think the reskilling agenda should be top of mind for any CEO. If it's not, we have a challenge in organizations. And if I take Old Mutual as an example, it really is critical in terms of our 2030 strategy. And we've built in the reskilling imperative and really put money behind that. So the sponsorship, the investment also needs to be very deliberate from our key leaders. So I think as human capital team members, we can start to influence that a lot harder and a lot more. So if the reskilling agenda is not one of your strategic investment priorities or projects for the future, we need to push that agenda a lot harder. Coming back to Prof's point around the learning culture, we're really seeing a pivot of this. COVID has just accelerated that. And the need for just-in-time learning for all, we've seen that's taken off quite well. However, just access to content is not sufficient in and of itself. There has to be a deliberate strategy around how we build the drive from a job-specific, career-specific perspective. So there is that impetus to learn versus a push. So we've seen that in our organization, building in more social learning strategies is assisting, it's helping that. And actually there is no one size fits all strategy. It needs to be multi-pronged. As I mentioned, starting off with leaders, influencing through the social teams, such as your employee resource groups. In our organization, we have millennials at Old Mutual or our Old Mutual Women's Network. And sometimes we underestimate how influencing through those influencer groups become so critical. We've started to see a lot more uptake once there's sponsorship and once there's acceleration through those groups. And I think the last point I'll mention is just around the self-driven journey. I've seen most attendees have said just the motivation to learn becomes a challenge. It's the shifting mindsets, really encouraging individuals to learn. Yes, one can, take the horse to the water. However, it needs to be really self-driven, and the learning style needs to shift at an individual level. And that's not an easy solve. I think in our organization, we're seeing, yes, there's an array of tools and an array of resources, but the uptake is slower than expected. So we're still on that journey to shift behavior, to shift mindsets, and to help individuals really unlearn what's been learned. There's a wonderful book by Adam Grant called Think Again. I would encourage everyone on this call to read the book, because it talks, he talks about the challenge of us not being deliberate about unlearning. And I think when it comes to the self-driven learning journey, that's the challenge we have as individuals, is that we believe we have acquired enough knowledge to be able to function in the now and in the future. And that's the greatest stumbling block. We need the recognition that that is not enough. And as Prof mentioned, it will not be enough. So the continuous learning journey has definitely got to be employee-led. So it's still a work in progress, Nick, but we're doing quite a bit from an all mutual perspective to start driving that.
Trying to go off mute there. Thanks, Sanjana. Just before we carry on, there are one or two questions that are coming through in the chat. But if I could just ask again that everyone address it to panelists and attendees, just so that the attendees on the call also get to see what questions are being asked. And as mentioned, we will tackle them towards the end of the session. Thank you. Ryno, what is the differentiator between individuals who learn faster and adapt better and those who don't? And then I'll then also throw that same question over to Prof Nick as well.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, good question. I think what we've definitely seen, and it aligns with many other studies, especially I'm thinking of Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset. I'm sure most people are familiar with some form of it, but it's interesting how that translates into learning as well, because I think mindset has so much to do with how you approach learning and how learning is digested. If you just look at how our brains operate, if something is important and relevant and prioritized for you, your brain bumps it up in importance for remembering. So if you as an individual approach learning and I want to say failure as well, dealing with failure, how you deal with failure, how you deal with moving forward, it's all about that mindset of really continuously improving and not getting detracted by the small little stumbling blocks, but constantly persevering through it, setting goals and really achieving them one step at a time. And like Sanjana also said, not with that being that requirement of it being a continuous ongoing process. I'm sure Nick will talk about that lifelong learning, but that view of everything, you've been doing this for a long time, things are changing. So we need to be agile and relearn what we think we know, because it's evolving so quickly. And I think having that mindset of the humility and the mindset of I can learn more, I can do more, that really does translate into better learning, accelerated learning, and really high performance of what we've seen as well. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ryno. If I reflect on the question, right? So what differentiates the fast learners from the ones who don't, right? Building on what you're sharing, what I've seen from different studies is that curiosity plays a big role when it comes to learning. And then beyond that, it's also again about people's mindsets. There's a mindset about, are you making learning a priority? Are you willing to invest, personal time and probably, money in your own development? But also people who are really, kind of amazing learners, they are aware that, learning is basically, it is the next social security, right? So basically, if you develop yourself, that will help you to stay employable down the road. And then when it comes to adopting, it's all about, people are more resilient. They are adopting better to a fast-changing environment, but also people who are used to change, right? So people who have done a number of different things in their personal or professional life are more adaptable, are more agile, nimble, can make things happen in organizations. So it's all about the experience that we are developing over the lifetimes of our careers.
Awesome, thank you. So while we're on the topic of mindsets, how can we unlearn the mindsets that detract from our ability to learn at an accelerated pace? Again, I'm going to throw this over to you, Ryno, and then also Prof Nick can chip in as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think it's an important part, right? So it's called reskilling and upskilling for a reason. You know, you have to unlearn a lot of what you learned at, you know, the way we learned at school, especially in South Africa. I think it's a very fixed formula, and we are taught to really follow that structure, and then after that get thrown into a world of work which is so completely different that you have to really challenge how you've been learning. It's a new reality often, and I think what we've definitely seen in terms of personal mastery and really shifting those mindsets is the learning goals and how individual, like Prof Nick said as well, prioritize their learning. How do you view your learning, your personal learning growth as part of your goals? It's not just something that happens by the by. It's ingrained into your habits. It's ingrained into that way of thinking about your future. So really challenging how you prioritize learning and the mindset that is required to really fuel that. You know, those are the fundamentals of really making that shift.
Yeah, thank you. If I reflect on it further, if we look at many organizations and we ask ourselves the question, who are the fast learners, who are the slow learners, etc. And what we typically see is it's kind of a bell-shaped curve, right? So there's a small percentage of people in our organizations who are really, kind of self-directed learners, and they're always out there. They read articles, they watch videos, they connect with people, they know what's coming in their profession. They're always ahead of the curve. And I would argue that, the L&D function, doesn't have to do anything for those folks, because they're all fine. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people, no matter what we do from an L&D function perspective, content, career coaching, mentoring, storytelling, you name it, they don't get it. They are hardly moving. And hopefully that's a very small percentage. And then we have a lot of people who are kind of the majority, who are somewhere in between. And that's where we need to, as from an L&D perspective, say, okay, how can we help those to move them more towards the right side of the curve? And how to make sure that they become self-directed learners. Now, what I believe, from a corporate perspective is that as a corporation, from an HR perspective, there are a number of things that we can do. We can provide a platform. We can, tell the story, why it makes sense. We can have career conversations with people. We can make learning available in digital and blend it in a way that it becomes personalized and very effective. And at the end of the day, it's still up to individuals to take advantage of it, right? And it goes back to, developing the mindset to be a lifelong learner. And to me, the story is not about learning, because what we have seen in research is that the people who are, kind of resistant towards learning, a number of them, and Nick, you are referring to it too, right? So a number of them, when they think about learning, lifelong learning, they think about school. When they think about school, they say, honestly, this was not the best time of my life. And therefore, they are not excited about learning. And I believe from an, L&D perspective, we need to make sure that, the story is not about learning for the sake of learning. The story is about, do you want to stay employable? The answer is yes. Do you want to retire at a moment that you are financially stable to some extent? The answer is yes. And therefore, in order to do that, we need to continue learn and grow. And if L&D can provide, ways, and there's also HR and how we design work, ways of learning that it doesn't feel I go to school, but it's basically part of my job. It's basically part of what I do every day. Learning in the workflow, learning on the job. And if we make that happen in organizations, I believe, you know, magic will happen. And a lot of people who are in the middle or even maybe on the left side of the curve, they are moving to the right.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. Lomé, from your experience, what works and what does not work to accelerate learning? And maybe draw comparison, if you can, between things like failed gimmicks versus, you know, deep learning and adoption. Yeah, thanks, Lomé.
Awesome, thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining. It's lovely to be here. I think a lot of what my other panel speakers have mentioned, I think already touches on a lot of what we've seen. There's a lot of gimmicky learning interventions out there, and some of them attract attention initially, but then, you know, it doesn't really necessarily bring through the deeper learning. But I think maybe just to echo what Sanjana said around sponsorship, and we've just finished a project with Old Mutual where it was front and, you know, foremost. We with everything being virtual, we did a lot of that through digital platforms, but really having clear sponsorship throughout every single program that is designed, whether it's even a small little activity that's being done, and also Prof Nick mentioned storytelling, so that it comes alive. It's not just, oh, as the CEO, you know, it's my job to say that I believe in this, but really to tell, this is my own story. This is why learning is important to me. This is, you know, giving it a unique flair to, this is something that I deeply believe in, and I can really testify to the impact that it's made in Old Mutual. So I think that is something that's extremely important. The next thing is also line manager involvement. So whenever we've run projects specifically around learning and accelerated learning, as much as you work with the learner, that's the same amount of work that you need to do with the line manager. And it's about the ecosystem, right? So I loved what Nick was saying in the flow of work. If you're not working with the line managers, it's going to be really difficult for the learners to apply what they are learning in the theory part back at work. So really supporting line managers to actively be involved, create opportunities together with the learners, which I suppose is maybe a third thing. So how do we design blended learning, which means there will be a theory part, but there will be a real play part where we incorporating action learning, where we're incorporating social learning opportunities, whether it's coaching or mentoring or peer conversations. We've had tremendous success with learning integration sessions where it's facilitated conversations. There's no particular theory. The theory was already covered, whether that's in the online learning content or in workshops, etc. But the purpose of a learning integration session is really to bring myself into it. This is what I'm struggling with. What can I learn from others? How are you dealing with it? And so that's also been hugely successful because it makes it real. It brings it into the life of. And I think the more we're able to bring it into the typical workflow, my life as per usual, my daily life, my daily rhythms, the things that I'm really struggling with, the increased the learning will be, the knowledge retention. So it's not just I'm reading through this article and then 60% of that is forgotten, which is generally what the research tells us. But if we reinforce it with some action learning, some social learning, which I suppose gets to, it needs to be blended. It needs to be reinforced consistently. The same information brought in various different channels. And I still love the 70-20-10 framework. It really does make a difference, especially if we're blending multiple different learning opportunities. So yeah, I think for now, that's what I think what works. There's a lot more, but let me stop there.
Perfect. Thanks, Lomé. And Ryno, from your experience, same, anything different?
Yeah, so I think Lomé did a great job of summarizing a lot of what we've seen. I think maybe just to add to that point, the through line that we've seen really has been that active participation part, right? So there's a lot of solutions to kickstart some ecosystem where you just buy a whole bunch of off-the-shelf courses and, you know, kind of piece it together. And what often fails with those kind of interventions is the learning lacks that active involvement, active application. And that's why I think it's so important that Lomé talked about all of the integration into business and the sponsorship and the line manager involvement with any training that does happen, because where it falls flat quite often is the transfer back into the business. It's pointless if we're upskilling and reskilling on things, but it's not adding to the return on investment for the organization. It's not being applied. It's not giving it that right soil and combination of elements where those skills are really transferred back into the business. And if we look at the most innovative companies, right, they all have that culture of creating a collective intelligence almost inside the organization, where knowledge sharing and skill sharing and teaching what you've learned, I think there's a lot of power in creating cultures of that, of how do we bring all of this knowledge back into the business, into the pot. We see a lot of, highly skilled and knowledgeable people exiting the business and then creating the succession gap where, those measures weren't put in place. So I think that active participation from everyone and then active transfer back into the business, I think there's a lot of power and often is the differentiator in what we've seen.
Lovely, thanks, Ryno. Sanjana, I know you're quite the master in this. Excuse my wording, but what role does personal mastery play in accelerated learning? With respect to time management, boundary settings, managing your own brain and thoughts and energy, and then obviously from a prioritization perspective as well.
Sure, thanks, Nick. I think when we think of the topic of personal mastery in the last 18 months or so, it's been on the backdrop of just managing my life and my well-being, really. With the movement out of our office spaces into our virtual reality, and having to juggle work and family life, the personal mastery component has been focused on coping and well-being. And I've seen a comment in the chat around how does the well-being component play in from a learning perspective? And I think that's very relevant, because when we do our surveys around learning interventions and why people do not have the time to learn, it's related to overwhelm. It's related to I can't prioritize, help me prioritize from a line perspective, which comes back to Lomé's point around the line leader enablement and education component. And it comes back to, I have too much on my plate in terms of work delivery and task that I don't have the space or the time for all the mental capacity to learn. So I think how one addresses this is definitely, it's not a one strategy. There is an individual self component to this around how one masters your own life in terms of prioritization. I see Prof mentioned the fact that, it's no longer a case of, being relevant. So the learning impetus is about relevance. It's no longer about do I have to learn. There was another comment related to what if I don't want to learn? Then the challenge is, does that individual have a space in our organizations going forward? If there's lack of drive to learn, because the relevance, it's now a fight for relevance, and that becomes critical. So I think the self component in terms of managing your own time, your own boundaries, and as mentioned before, building it into the workflow so that in our jobs, there's opportunity to learn. In our teams, there's opportunity to learn. Something that we've introduced at All Mutual at an organizational level is called a deal hour, drop everything and learn hour. So for an hour every month, the entire organization from Ian to the lowest level employee drops everything and we learn. Yes, it may be 1 hour a month, but it's starting the culture of learning across the organization. The other strategy is where leaders have book clubs, something that we call course clubs, so that, with a social pressure, one will not show up to a course club not having learned or read through that article or been on that learning journey. So quite an interesting strategy. So making space is important. And I think the influencing of the team and the leader, so influencing up. if the team is not structured so that there is time to learn, or if we can do things better in terms of how we prioritize as a team, the employee or HR can also influence leaders to ensure that we make the space. I think the other element that we underestimate is just the use of data. Data is now the new currency in learning and development, and we underutilize it. Understanding your own rhythms and cycles in terms of how you set your own meetings will be important. Is there a need for an hour meeting versus a 55 versus a 30-minute meeting? So what we've done at Old Mutual is we've got a tool called Workplace Analytics that thankfully gives us that data. We don't have to mine it and search for it ourselves. So on a Monday morning, it tells me what are my opportunities for the week to create space for myself. So a great investment for those of you on the call who are looking for a great tool to help with well-being, time management, and just meeting management, I would recommend it. And another tool that's really great is Viva Insights. What a great Microsoft tool that's just been launched, so hot off the press. That is it's an employee experience tool, but it's now building learning well-being mechanisms into nudge technology that we can build into our Outlook and meeting routines daily. So I would definitely say utilize the tools out there, but also influence leaders, influence teams, and last but certainly not least is managing your own space and your own time, and definitely build in the learning and well-being components together, so it's not seen as isolated or different practices.
Awesome, thanks, Sanjana. While you were speaking, Lomé was smiling quite a lot and nodding her head quite a lot there. Lomé, is there anything you want to add to what Sanjana has been saying?
I was bobbing my head because I think the neuroscience supports everything that Sanjana said, right? So when our brains are under stress, when we have 5,000 things that we need to focus on, when we're distracted, our brains just are not optimized to learn. And so I think that's why it makes so much sense in terms of personal mastery, because that's just the way that our brains are wired. So I think it's almost a foundational skill, Nick. If you want to be a fast learner, personal mastery is the first place that you need to start. You need to, and I almost want to start with self-awareness, because if I understand me, my goals, what gets me excited, as Sanjana said, my own rhythms, what drains me, what triggers me, what dreams I have, that's the fuel that you can use to fire then, when you're needing to access some of the learning. So I think that self-awareness component. The other thing in a team setting that we've just seen really, in all of the coaching conversations that I've had, the thing that most leaders are struggling with is prioritization. Everything seems to be urgent. Everything seems to be important. And so that's really is, I think, a future skill that we're really going to hone into, so that we are as actively working on our to-don't list as we are working on our to-do list, and simplifying things and really questioning, is this indeed a priority? Is this report, is this compliance meeting, is the way things have been done, is it really important? Because if we're not actively taking things out, learning it's not going to organically just appear, time is not just going to organically appear for learning. We will have to take things out so that we can put learning in. And so there, I think it's perhaps not just personal mastery, it's almost a team mastery. How do we create a team culture, a team system that the leader drives to prioritize the things that are important, and then definitely to prioritize learning. I love the hour that Sanjana was talking about, because at first it really does need to be something that's enforced, right? It can become organic after a while, but initially, what are some of those rhythms that we put in as a team, as an organization, so that learning is really prioritized?
Awesome, thanks, Lomé. And then obviously just one of the really big queries, what we all really need to learn or find out from the session is how do we identify the learning needs quickly enough in order for us to respond effectively? I'm going to throw that out to Prof Nick, and if you could maybe sort of give us the link between strategy and learning, and possibly learning as making learning an actual executive agenda.
Yeah. No, thanks, Nick, and maybe also a moment to say something about a new book that I just published 2 weeks ago. The book is called 49 Tools for Learning and Development, and all the royalties are going to a foundation. So that's why I feel I can talk about it. And basically, in this book, actually, I have a number of chapters, tools on L&D strategy, from strategy to capability building, from capability building to the how of capability building. And, you know, obviously, it's, as mentioned before, it's key that from an organizational perspective, we make sure that, you know, what we do in terms of HR and L&D is really aligned with, you know, business priorities. So that's kind of the first thing. Now, when it comes to assessing capabilities, you know, in most organizations, this has happened actually in a more or less paper, you know, kind of more email-based way, right? But what I've seen actually that a growing number of organizations are using technology platforms and different solutions for that, and or have developed their own applications. So let me give you an example. I've been working with one financial services organization, and they have developed an app, and they have decided, you know, when you think about competency models, they said, you know what, in the past, every organization tried to develop their own competency model. And does that really make sense, right? So because a lot of the competencies are similar, we use some different words for it. And they said, you know what, let us use the competency model from the World Economic Forum, because that is something that's global. It's, you know, it has been, you know, researched quite a bit, and all these competencies and the way that they are described make all sense. So they have used the World Economic Forum competency model. Of course, for their technical competencies, like being in financial services, there are specific competencies as well, and they added those actually. And then they developed an app, and every person can do a self-assessment on the competencies in terms of, you know, where are you? Then you basically send a link to, you know, people around you, colleagues, and they're all anonymous, but also maybe family members and others. They fill it out, and then based on that, you get a sense of, okay, on the competency problem solving, I think I'm a 3, but most people around me say I'm a 2. And if this is an important competency for my organization, there's a gap. And then the question is how to close the gap, right? And what kind of learning interventions can you participate in that will help you, or work experiences that will help you to close the gap. But also from a cooperation perspective, if you aggregate actually the feedback that people are getting, you get a sense of how are we doing in problem solving in our organization at different levels, right? You get a good insight, and it goes very quickly, so very effective, very efficient. And I believe, you know, using technology for all of this, you know, is obviously the way to go.
Cool, awesome, thank you. Lomé, sorry, did you have, is there anything you would like to add on that? Possibly even from a, you know, strictly South African perspective?
Sure, I completely agree with Nick. I think the era of data is upon us, right? So we need to, from a design point of view, how are we building in metrics? How are we building data intelligence so that we can really feed off the feedback in an autonomous way, and constantly doing pulse checks so that we can gauge where our learners are at. What are they struggling with? What content do they find boring? And making it easy so that it's really, we've worked with software where it's a thumbs up and a thumbs down. And if you want to have a comment, you know, leave a comment, but it's really breaking down feedback as regularly and as often as we possibly can so that we can become more intelligent and use AI to really build that. I think the only other thing that I maybe want to add is really understanding the future skills needs. And I think that brings us back to Sanjana's point that she started off with way in the beginning. The strategy needs to drive our learner needs, right? So there's a part of how do we serve the learning our learners and that feedback we're getting from the learners. But then what is it that we want to focus on? Our strategy needs to give us a very sharp idea of this is where we're going. What are the skills that we need to get there? How do we assess the gaps that we currently have? And then, as Nick was saying, how do we build that gap? Do we buy? Do we borrow? Do we transform? Do we get machines to do it in the meantime? But if we don't know what that is, and if we don't know what the gap is, it's really difficult. And honestly, that's probably been the biggest work that we've done over the last couple of months, because many organizations are in that place, understanding the future skills. What do we have? How do we assess that gap? And what is our strategy to alleviate that? I'm also quite excited that Nick, Professor Nick, the study that you spoke about, we have embarked with the Northwest University on a very similar study where we're looking at financial services, the entire industry. And it's so amazing how all of these amazing companies have just come together to say, well, let's define that competency framework for our industry so that we can feed off of each other, so that we can really make a difference in South Africa. We're focusing specifically now just on the South African community and industry, and start to interplay using, creating academies for the digital and data skills. And so I think if we understand our learning needs, if we're understanding what some of those competencies are, it just makes the job of then deploying the learning so much easier. Yeah.
Cool, thank you very much. Some nice questions been coming in from the audience today. So I want to kick off with a couple of those. There are two which I want to add together. From the first one from Heather, where she asks, do you believe that companies' attitudes to learning plays a part on the ability of the employee to learn? And then tie that in with, I think it's one of my colleagues, because it came up as my name. So maybe someone's jumped in there as well. But it's then said, similar to Heather's question, if senior leadership doesn't display a commitment to ongoing learning, the culture won't take off. So how does one go about getting top management to lead by example when it comes to continuous learning? Who would like to take on that one? Or do I need to pick? Ryno came off first.
Maybe I'll just answer the first question, and then we can take a poke at it. Does a company's attitude towards learning affect the ability? I think definitely yes. That ecosystem, that culture, what is reinforced, ultimately shapes how you view your job, being successful at your job. If an organization's ethos and culture and, the way they talk about being the best version of yourself and how you fit into this organization, that culture is significant. And if one thing that we've learned from the chaotic times of late in South Africa is herd mentality, in a sense of when you see something around you being the norm or being how things are done, it pulls you, it creates a bit of a fire. So I definitely think that how we talk about it and what psychological safety we create around learning in the organization is a fundamental component to unleashing the mindsets in the individuals. So definitely a big part of leadership involvement there. And maybe I'll throw the second part of the question to one of my fellow panelists on the leadership involvement in that equation.
I think Sanjana also wanted to tackle that as well. Sanjana?
Yeah, happy to come in, Nick. I definitely concur with Ryno around the leadership, endorsement, ambassadorship, and owning the learning agenda. I think I mentioned it earlier. But based on the question, if companies are not endorsing learning, does it impact the employees' need or want to learn? And I think absolutely so, in terms of the social movement point that Ryno mentioned, but also around the entire drive that exists in an organization and the why behind it. So if leaders endorse the why and also role model learning it starts to create a movement within an organization. I think the point on psychological safety is very important, because moving into a learning space requires vulnerability, requires being able to step back and understanding that I don't know everything. And sometimes leaders are not comfortable doing that. So it requires a different skill set, mindset shift for leaders. And as much as I don't like going down this road of it's on performance contracts and it's mandatory, unfortunately, we've seen that actually shifts the dial. If what is measured is what gets done. And if you're building learning, and if you're building 8C imperatives into leaders' scorecards and into leaders' must-dos, then yes, there's more of a need as to why I should drive it. But outside of that, it should be something that's part of a leader's job into the future, into the new world of work. So it does then become a question of the leadership relevance for leading in the new world of work, if there's not a case of driving a learning culture. And someone else mentioned, cutting the L&D budget during times of crises. And the research has shown that that's the biggest mistake organizations can make, because the upward trajectory in terms of the recovery phase means that you're taking a lot longer, whereas other organizations are well ahead of the curve. So the business case has to be created by HC around why we cannot afford to cut our L&D budgets during times of crises. We're just going to be on the back foot when we do hit the recovery phase. So I think definitely an ecosystem solution and leadership mindset shift is critical.
Cool, thank you. Now, Nazneen asked, obviously there are some people who are resistant to learning, and she wants to know, how detrimental is it to make it compulsory for people to participate, or is that just something that that individual just has to deal with?
Yeah, I don't know if this expression exists in South Africa. There's a Dutch expression, I will translate it in English. You can bring a horse to the water, but you cannot let it drink. Huh? Yeah. And that's, I think, what's the case with learning, right? So you can tell people, you need to be in the classroom, etc. But it doesn't mean if they really don't want to learn, guess what? Their mind is somewhere else, right? You can force people to take an online course, and maybe at the end we have an assessment. And the only thing what they do is they try to memorize just the stuff so they can pass the test. And then, kind of one day later, they have not retained anything. So I think that, make it compulsory is, only get us so far, right? So we need to find other techniques, to inspire people, to persuade people, to learn and grow.
Cool, thank you very much. I think we've got time for one last question. It'll be a bit of a combined question. So there was someone mentioned, particularly in this time from an emotional and financial distress perspective, coupled with the last question that Heather asked, saying in so many companies nowadays have retrenched staff during the lockdown, the pandemic. The workload has doubled, sometimes tripled. Service levels have dropped in companies, and they need to, build that up. And then people are working 12 or more hours a day. Where is the time to do the training? Lomé.
Take a go at it, Nick.
Yes, please.
I think the question for me, we're asking the wrong question. We're asking where is the time, right? So we can't get more time. There's 24 hours in a day, like that's a fixed. For me, the question is, what are we seeing learning as? We're seeing learning as you need to do your job, and then if you have some time left, then you'll do that. Then you'll learn in that little bit of time that's left. And that's the wrong mindset. That's the wrong question. If learning is part of your job, then the learning will happen in the 12 hours a day anyway. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if we're seeing learning is my ticket to becoming more effective at my job, to saving time, to becoming more innovative, to then I'm approaching it from a different perspective. It's not, oh, I'll get to it once I've done my work. I need to get to it so that I can do my work in a shorter amount of time, or, you know, or whatever that goal might be. So we need to start thinking about learning as that's the secret, that's the ticket, not the something that happens when we get to it.
Awesome, thank you, Lomé. We have got to 3 o'clock. It is the end of our time. We could go on for hours, but we do need to bring it to a close. So just a great big thank you to Prof Lomé, Ryno, Sanjana, and Prof Nick for joining us today and for sharing such insightful information. Before we jump off, have I done the wrong thing here? You can probably all see the wrong part of my screen. The next HR Indaba Network webinar we have coming up is Agile Leadership Unlocked, and this is brought to us by HFM Talent Index on the 18th of August 2021. So please, everyone, register and join that, and we will see you all soon. And again, thank you for the panelists. Thank you to the attendees for joining. Have a lovely day. Keep warm, keep safe, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Sanjana.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.